He gave shelter to a homeless grandma, but her hidden identity shocked him forever. The late afternoon sun leaned lazily over the city, spilling its golden light across the cracked sidewalks and weathered brick buildings. It was the kind of hour when the streets felt caught between two worlds, half asleep from the lull of midday, yet already stirring with the pulse of evening. Long shadows stretched like dark rivers beneath people's feet, bending around bicycles, parked cars, and the old lampposts that lined the street. On the corner of Maple and Fifth stood a modest restaurant with a green awning faded by the years, its windows fogged faintly with the heat of simmering pots, and the air that drifted outside was thick with the comforting smell of fried chicken, collard greens, and warm cornbread. It was the kind of smell that could pull memories out of even the hardest heart. Sunday dinners, family laughter, a sense of belonging. Inside, Marcus Carter moved with quiet efficiency, his shoulders square but his steps unhurried. He was a man in his early 40s, built sturdy from years of work, with skin the deep brown of polished mahogany. His short-cropped hair showed threads of gray at the temples, and a neatly trimmed goatee framed his strong jawline. There was weariness in his eyes, the kind that came from balancing ledgers late at night and waking before dawn to fire up the ovens. But behind the tiredness, there was also something steady, kindness perhaps, or maybe just a deep sense of responsibility. Lunch crowd had long since thinned, leaving the restaurant in a rare moment of stillness. Marcus wiped down the last of the tables, the rags sliding across the wood in slow circles. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, mingling with the faint clatter of pots cooling in the back kitchen. He glanced around the dining room, proud of its humble warmth. The walls bore framed photographs of his parents and grandparents, all of them once owners of this very place. Generations had cooked here, served here, laughed and struggled here. This restaurant was not just a business, it was his family's legacy, one he carried like both a burden and a blessing. As he leaned against the counter, Marcus let his gaze wander toward the wide front window. Beyond the glass, the city moved. On in fragments, a man pedaling a bicycle too small for him, a mother tugging her toddler along by the hand, a bus groaning to a stop at the corner. And then, just beyond the edge of the awning, his eyes caught on something unusual, something that made him straighten almost unconsciously. An elderly woman stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a small boy. Her clothes were worn and tired, the fabric of her cardigan frayed at the sleeves, her faded floral dress clinging loosely to her thin frame. A simple scarf held back her gray hair, though wisps had escaped and fluttered in the breeze. Her back carried a slight stoop, yet her posture spoke of quiet dignity, as though she were determined to stand tall despite the weight of years and hardship. The boy at her side looked no older than 7. His light brown skin glowed faintly in the late sunlight, though the oversized hoodie he wore seemed to swallow him whole. His jeans were scuffed at the knees, his sneakers too big and loose-laced. He clung to her hand with the kind of grip that suggested fear of letting go, his wide dark eyes darting between the restaurant and the street. For a long moment, they didn't move. The woman's gaze lingered on the front door as if it were a threshold too heavy to cross, a place she wasn't sure she belonged. She pressed her lips together, whispering something to the boy, reassurance, perhaps her hesitation. The boy tilted his face upward to her, then looked back at the window, his expression caught between hunger and hope. Marcus found himself frozen in the act of watching them. Something in their stillness struck him, something in the way the child's hand gripped the grandmother's as though it were his anchor in a drifting world. He saw the weariness in the woman's stance, the faint tremor in her shoulders, and the unspoken story in her eyes. She did not look like a stranger seeking charity. She looked like someone carrying a history far larger than the bundle in her arms. Outside, the city's rhythm continued. Cars passed, voices rose and fell, life pulsed on as usual. But for Marcus, time seemed to narrow, funneling down to this one image, a grandmother and a child hesitating at his door. He didn't yet know why they had come or what they might ask. He only knew that the sight of them stirred something inside him, something deep and unnameable. As though fate itself had paused to wait for the choice he was about to make, the rag slipped from his hand onto the counter. He stood straighter, his breath quiet in the stillness of his restaurant. The door remained unopened, but the weight of their hesitation pressed against him like a silent plea. And in that moment, Marcus realized that whatever happened next would not be ordinary. The bell above the restaurant door jingled softly, a sound Marcus had heard 1,000 times, yet this time it carried a strange weight. He looked up from the counter, rag still damp in his hand, and saw the old woman gently push the door open. She stepped inside as if she were intruding into a sacred space, her hand still clasping the boy's. The air seemed to change with her presence. She paused just beyond the threshold, her shoulders drawn in, her eyes scanning the room as though searching for permission to exist there. For a heartbeat, Marcus thought she might retreat, but then she pressed her lips together, gathered the child closer, and cleared her throat. I'm sorry to trouble you," she said softly, her voice trembling in that delicate place between dignity and desperation. Each word seemed careful, measured, as though she had rehearsed this in her mind 12 times before stepping through the door. We haven't eaten all day. And tonight," she faltered, her gaze dropping to the worn shoes on her feet, the floorboards beneath them. "Tonight we've nowhere to go." The boy squeezed her hand tighter, his small body half hidden behind her skirt. His eyes, large and dark with hunger, roamed past Marcus and landed on the counter where plates still sat from the lunch rush, half-covered cornbread cooling in its basket, a bowl of fried chicken set aside for later. He licked his lips unconsciously, then quickly looked down. Embarrassed by his own longing, Marcus felt something twist inside him. The scene struck too close, the boy's unspoken hunger, the grandmother's fragile pride, the heavy silence between words. He remembered, as though it were yesterday, standing in a church kitchen with his own mother years ago, waiting while she asked for leftovers from the Sunday meal. He remembered the shame in her eyes as she smiled through it, the way she whispered apologies even as his stomach growled. The weight of those memories pressed hard on him now, heavier than the rag in his hand or the ledger of unpaid bills in the office drawer. The restaurant was his life, but it was also barely surviving. Every month the numbers ran thin. Every week he told himself not to give away too much food, not to take on burdens he could not carry. Yet here they were, this grandmother and child standing in the fading light of his dining room, and he knew what the choice had to be. He set the rag aside and straightened, his voice warm but steady. "You don't need to apologize," he said. "Come on in, sit down." The woman hesitated, as if unsure she had heard correctly. But Marcus gestured toward a booth near the window, and slowly, cautiously, she led the boy there. They slid into the seat, the boy climbing up beside her, still clutching her hand as though afraid she might disappear. Marcus moved to the kitchen without another word, pulling out plates with a speed that came not from obligation but from instinct. He piled fried chicken high, added thick slices of cornbread, a scoop of greens, and poured sweet tea into glasses that caught the golden glow of the setting sun. When he placed the plates before them, the boy's eyes widened as though the food itself were a miracle. The grandmother bowed her head, whispering a quiet prayer before picking up her fork. She nudged the boy gently. "Go on," she said. He needed no second invitation. Marcus stepped back, watching in silence as the boy ate with small, careful bites, as though afraid the food might vanish if he rushed. The grandmother ate more, slowly, every so often pausing to murmur another soft word of thanks, not just to God, but Marcus sensed, to him as well. Something stirred deep in his chest, a warmth that pushed back against the shadows of worry. For a while, the bills didn't matter, the slow day didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet sound of chewing, the faint sigh of relief that slipped from the grandmother's lips, the way the boy's shoulders finally loosened as hunger eased. When the plates were nearly empty and the room had grown dim with evening, Marcus cleared his throat. "I've got a small storage room upstairs," he said, his tone casual, though his heart beat quicker. "It's not much, just an old bed and some space, but you're welcome to stay there tonight. Both of you." The grandmother looked up sharply, her eyes glistening. For a long moment, she said nothing, her mouth opening and closing as though words failed her. Then, finally, she whispered, We couldn't impose." "You're not imposing," Marcus interrupted gently. He gave a small smile. "It's just one night. No one should be out there with nowhere to go, not you, not him." The boy's gaze flicked between them, his eyes wide with something that looked like hope, fragile, flickering, but alive. The grandmother reached across the table, her weathered hand trembling as she rested it over Marcus's. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice breaking. And in that moment, Marcus knew this was more than just a meal, more than just a bed for the night. It was a crossing of paths that would not soon be forgotten. The smell of fried chicken lingered in the air long after the plates were set before them. Marcus leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, trying not to appear as though he was watching too closely. Yet he couldn't help it. Something about this grandmother and child drew his attention in ways he couldn't quite explain. The boy, though clearly hungry, did not devour the food recklessly the way most children would. Instead, he picked up his fork carefully, placed his napkin on his lap, and whispered, "Thank you, sir," before tasting the first bite. His voice carried a softness and formality that startled Marcus. Words delivered not with the wildness of a child, but with the restraint of someone far older. Every so often, he paused between bites, glancing at his grandmother as if to ask permission before reaching for more. And each time she gave a slight nod, her own movements equally deliberate. Marcus noticed the way she spoke, too. When she thanked him for the meal, her tone held a peculiar gravity. "You've done us a kindness I won't forget, Mr. Carter," she said, her words wrapped in a formality that didn't quite fit her weathered appearance. It was the way a teacher might thank a student, or a woman accustomed to respect might acknowledge an equal. There was no begging in her voice, no grasping or pleading, only a quiet dignity, as though she had once stood in a different station of life. Curiosity gnawed at Marcus, but he remained silent, unwilling to pry. Instead, he busied himself with wiping the counter and stacking dishes, listening with half an ear as they ate. When he turned back, his eyes caught on something unusual. The grandmother thought herself unseen. Her grandson was distracted with his food. From her worn cardigan, she pulled a small notebook, its edges frayed, but its pages crisp. She opened it with care, shielding it slightly with her hand, and began to write. The motion was subtle, small strokes of a pen moving with practiced rhythm. Marcus frowned, curiosity deepening. It wasn't what she wrote that struck him. He couldn't see the words. It was the way she held the pen. Firm, confident, as though writing was second nature, as though her thoughts had long been disciplined into neat lines on paper. Not the idle scrawling of someone passing time, but the practiced hand of a woman accustomed to recording things of importance. She closed the notebook quickly when the boy shifted beside her, slipping it back into her cardigan pocket with a motion so natural it seemed rehearsed. By the time Marcus moved to refill their glasses, her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her expression serene. Later, after the plates were cleared and the boy's eyes began to droop with the heaviness of a full stomach, Marcus led them upstairs to the small storage room above the restaurant. It was modest, an old iron bed with a patchwork quilt, a lamp that cast a soft yellow glow, shelves stacked with boxes of supplies. Yet to them, it seemed a sanctuary. The grandmother thanked him again, her hand brushing lightly over the quilt, as though it were silk. "You've given us more than a meal tonight," she said quietly, her eyes shining in the dim light. Marcus gave a small nod, embarrassed by the weight of her gratitude. "It's nothing," he murmured, though in truth he felt it was everything. He left them to rest, but sleep came slowly to him that night. Long after he had closed up and retired to his own room, the sounds from upstairs drifted through the floorboards. The boy coughed a rough, dry sound that made Marcus wince. Immediately after, he heard the grandmother's voice, low and steady, humming an old gospel hymn. The tune rose and fell like a prayer carried on the wind, wrapping around the boy's coughs, soothing them into silence. Marcus lay still, listening. The melody was one he knew, though he hadn't heard it since childhood. His mother had sung it in the kitchen while washing dishes. His grandmother had hummed it during long walks home from church. It was a song of endurance, of faith through hardship, of promises whispered in the dark. The sound stirred something buried deep within him, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. It wasn't just the hymn, it was the tenderness in her voice, the way it wrapped around the boy like a blanket, carrying a history of sorrow and strength. It was the reminder that even in the humblest of places, even in a small upstairs room above a struggling restaurant, there could be grace. A long time, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The hymn faded into silence, replaced by the even breathing of sleep. But the feeling it awakened in him lingered, a quiet echo in his chest that refused to leave. He couldn't shake the sense that this grandmother and her grandson carried more than hunger and weariness with them. They carried stories, secrets, and perhaps something even greater. And though he did not yet know it, their presence in his restaurant was the beginning of a mystery that would change his life forever. The first light of morning crept gently into the city, painting the buildings in pale gold. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir, shopkeepers raising their shutters, the low rumble of buses on their first routes, the faint chatter of voices drifting up with the dawn. Marcus woke earlier than usual, his body still heavy from the restless night. The hymn he had overheard lingered in his mind, threading through his dreams until the sunrise. He rubbed his eyes, pulled on his shirt, and made his way downstairs, already planning the breakfast he would prepare before sending the grandmother and boy on their way. But the moment he stepped into the restaurant, he stopped short. The air smelled faintly of soap and lemon polish. The wooden floors gleamed, the kind of shine he hadn't seen in months. Every table had been wiped until it reflected the morning light, chairs tucked neatly beneath them. The windows, usually smudged with fingerprints from children pressing their noses against the glass, were spotless, their panes catching the glow of the sun like mirrors. Marcus blinked, certain he was imagining it. He had left the place in its usual disarray the night before, crumbs scattered across tabletops, dishes stacked haphazardly by the sink, smudges of grease near the counter. Now it looked as though a team of cleaners had swept through in the dark. And there they were at the center of it all. The grandmother knelt near a stack of neatly organized boxes, her thin frame bent as she shifted the last crate into place. Beside her, the boy stood proudly, balancing a pile of small plates in his arms, his face glowing with the effort. When they noticed him, the grandmother straightened quickly, brushing her hands against her cardigan. A faint flush touched her cheeks, though her eyes held steady. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly, almost timidly. "We didn't want to leave without giving something back." Marcus's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked around at the gleaming room, then back at them. The boy was grinning shyly, clearly proud of his contribution. The grandmother's expression was different. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something else, a quiet insistence on dignity, on not being seen as a burden you didn't have to do this, Marcus managed finally, his voice rough with something he couldn't name. Her smile deepened, though it trembled at the edges. Perhaps not, but kindness should never go unanswered. The boy carefully set down the plates, then scampered to her side, slipping his hand into hers. His oversized hoodie hung loose on his small frame, but the brightness in his eyes made him look less fragile than he had the night before. Marcus stepped further into the room, still dazed by what he saw. He wanted to say more, to ask questions. Who are you really? Why do you carry yourself like this? But the words caught in his throat. Something told him the time wasn't right. Instead, he moved to the counter and began preparing breakfast, the clatter of pans filling the silence. He scrambled eggs, fried bacon until it crisped, and sliced fresh fruit onto plates. The boys' eyes followed every movement eagerly, his small stomach audibly growling. When Marcus set the plates before them, the grandmother lowered her head once more in prayer, her voice low but steady. She whispered thanks not just for the food, but for the man who opened his door when no one else would. The words lodged themselves in Marcus's chest. He had never thought of himself as extraordinary. He was just a man trying to keep his family's restaurant alive, trying to make ends meet. Yet in her voice, he heard something weightier, as if his small act of kindness had been more than chance. As they finished eating, the grandmother reached into her cardigan. For a moment, Marcus thought she might pull out the notebook again. But instead, she drew out a small folded paper. She held it carefully, as though it were fragile, and pressed it into his hand. Her eyes shone, full of meaning. She didn't speak aloud. "Thank you, Mr. Carter, for the meal, for the bed, for seeing us." He unfolded the paper slightly, glimpsing neat handwriting inside. But when he looked up to ask, she only shook her head. "You'll understand soon," she murmured. Then she rose, guiding the boy toward the door. The child turned once, lifting a hand in a shy wave, before disappearing into the morning light with her. Marcus stood alone in the spotless restaurant, the folded paper clutched in his hand. The silence pressed around him, heavy with questions. What had she written? Why did her words carry such weight? And why did he feel, deep in his bones, that this encounter was far from over? The sun climbed higher, flooding the restaurant with light. Yet beneath its warmth, Marcus felt a strange chill, the sense that his life had shifted in ways he could not yet see. Marcus stood in the middle of his restaurant long after the door closed behind the grandmother and her grandson. The folded paper felt impossibly heavy in his hand, as though it carried the weight of something he wasn't ready to face. He hesitated before finally sitting at one of the freshly polished tables and unfolding it with careful fingers. The handwriting was elegant, precise, each letter flowing into the next with a kind of practiced discipline. It read, "Kindness plants seeds unseen. Trust that what you've given will return to you in time. E. R. Marcus frowned. The initials were unfamiliar. He turned the paper over, searching for more, but that was all. A cryptic note, signed like a riddle. The day moved forward, customers drifting in for lunch, but Marcus's mind lingered on the grandmother and boy. Something about them nagged at him, the way she carried herself with quiet grace, the notebook she guarded, the hymn that had stirred his memories. It all formed a puzzle he couldn't piece together. 3 days passed before the mystery deepened. It was mid-afternoon when a sleek black sedan pulled up outside the restaurant. Out stepped a man in a tailored suit, his polished shoes gleaming under the sun. His eyes scanned the restaurant with deliberate precision before he stepped inside. Marcus stiffened. Suits like that didn't wander into his family-run place often. The man moved with the calm authority of someone accustomed to respect. He approached the counter, removing his sunglasses, and fixed Marcus with a steady gaze. "Are you Mr. Carter?" he asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "That's me. What can I do for you?" The man's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "I represent someone you recently helped. An elderly woman with her grandson. Do you recall?" Marcus's chest tightened. "Yes, I remember," the man exhaled, as though relieved. "She asked me to deliver a message. She wanted you to know she's safe, and—" he paused, pulling an envelope from his jacket, "that she never forgets those who show mercy." He placed the envelope on the counter. Marcus stared at it, reluctant to touch it. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. "Because I get the feeling she's not just some homeless woman off the street." The man's lips curved slightly, but he didn't answer. "Read the letter. You'll understand." With that, he left, the sound of the sedan's engine fading into the city streets. Hands trembling, Marcus tore the envelope open. Inside was another note, written in the same elegant handwriting. "Forgive the secrecy. My grandson and I fell into hardship after my son, his father, passed unexpectedly. I once had a life where people knew my name, but I chose silence rather than parade my pain. The night you opened your door to us, you gave more than food. You gave back my faith in people. Do not think your kindness went unseen." And then, at the bottom, Evelyn Ross. The name hit Marcus like a blow. Evelyn Ross, the educator, author, and community activist who had once graced newspapers and local television. A woman whose speeches about dignity and justice had inspired thousands. Years ago, she had mysteriously vanished from the public eye. Whispers circulating of personal tragedy, of retreat into solitude. Marcus's heart pounded. He remembered reading her essays in school, her words etched into his memory. Respect should not be earned through wealth, but through humanity. And now she had been sitting at his table, eating his food, humming hymns in his upstairs room. The weight of what he'd witnessed pressed against him. She hadn't been a stranger, she'd been a giant in his own community, brought low by grief, yet still carrying herself with grace. And he, a struggling restaurant owner, had unknowingly sheltered a woman whose legacy had touched countless lives. But the twists did not end there. That evening, a call came to the restaurant. Marcus answered. His voice wary. "Mr. Carter?" A woman's voice, warm and steady, filled his ear. He knew it instantly. It was her. "Evelyn Ross, I wanted to thank you again," she said. "You gave me a gift no one else did, kindness without recognition. No cameras, no expectations, just compassion." Marcus swallowed hard, unable to find words. "And because of that," she continued, "I've decided to return to the world I once left. But this time, I want to start here with you. Your restaurant will not struggle alone any longer." Before he could respond, she ended the call, leaving him stunned in the quiet hum of the empty dining room. The very next morning, news headlines broke across the city. Evelyn Ross reemerges after years in seclusion, community icon returns. Marcus read the article in disbelief. And there, in the final paragraph, his restaurant was named as the first venue for a new community initiative. She planned to launch. His small act of mercy had set into motion a change far greater than he could have imagined. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Marcus could have imagined. Word spread quickly about Evelyn Ross's reemergence, and with it came a wave of curiosity that swept through the city. People flocked to the restaurant, not just for the food, but for the story, the small place, where kindness had quietly taken root and blossomed into something far larger. Marcus had once struggled to keep the lights on, his bills stacked in the back office like a silent reminder of failure. Now, the very same tables that had often sat empty were alive with laughter, chatter, and the steady clatter of forks against plates. Families gathered to share fried chicken and cornbread. Workers stopped by for hearty lunches and community. Leaders filled the booths with discussions about new projects. Evelyn was championing. It wasn't just business that had changed. It was Marcus himself. Each day, as he looked out over the full dining room, he thought of that one night, the frail woman and her grandson standing uncertainly at his door. He thought of her trembling voice, her quiet dignity, her notebook hidden away as though it carried pieces of a life she wasn't ready to reveal. And he thought of the moment he chose to act, not with calculation, not with any expectation, but simply with the belief that no one should go hungry, no one should sleep in the cold if he had a bed to offer. Now, the truth of it unfolded before him in ways he never could have guessed. Evelyn Ross had returned to her community stronger than ever, and she had chosen his restaurant as her anchor. But beyond the fame and the crowds, Marcus understood something deeper. Kindness had come full circle. One evening, just as the sun began to dip low in the sky. Marcus stepped outside to catch his breath. The street was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. Behind him, through the restaurant's wide front windows, he could see families enjoying their meals, children sharing plates of cornbread, grandparents laughing softly, couples leaning close across tables. The place was alive in a way he had always dreamed but never thought possible. For a long moment, he stood there silently, his hands resting on the edge of the doorway. A warm breeze carried the scent of fried chicken out into the street, mingling with the laughter that drifted from inside. His mind wandered back to that night, the boy's wide, hungry eyes, the grandmother's quiet strength, the hymn that had stirred something long buried within him. He could still hear her voice, low and steady, singing into the dark to comfort a coughing child. That sound had changed him. It had reminded him that sometimes grace is found not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of showing up for another. Soul, the narrator's voice softened as though carried on the evening air. Kindness is never wasted. The hands we lift in their lowest moment may one day be the very hands that lift us higher. Marcus closed his eyes, breathing in deeply. He hadn't given that night expecting anything in return. He hadn't known who Evelyn Ross was, hadn't seen her as a figure from books or news articles. He had only seen a hungry boy and a weary grandmother, and he had done what any decent man should do. And yet, life had answered his act of compassion in a way he never could have imagined. True generosity comes without expectation, but it can return in ways we could never foresee. The truth of those words sank into Marcus as he stood beneath the sunset, his restaurant glowing with life behind him. He opened his eyes and looked again through the glass at the families inside. He smiled faintly, not for the success, not for the sudden recognition his restaurant had gained, but for the reminder etched into his heart. One night, a grandmother and her grandson had walked through his door, fragile yet unbroken, carrying with them a story of loss and resilience. And in choosing to open his door, Marcus had found not just a new chapter for his restaurant, but a new chapter for himself. The sun slipped lower, painting the horizon in deep orange. Marcus stood there a moment longer, a quiet man on a busy street, forever changed by the memory of two strangers, who had turned out not to be strangers at all. And though he knew he might never see them again, their presence lived on in every meal he served, every table he wiped down, every person he welcomed through the door. The night deepened, and the restaurant's lights shone brightly against the darkening sky, a beacon of what kindness could build, a reminder that the smallest acts of mercy could ripple outward, shaping lives in ways no one could predict. And with that, Marcus turned back inside, ready to serve the next family, his heart full of the memory of the grandmother and child who had changed his life forever.